Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Happy Hour for the Mind. You guys could tell from the email I sent you that I was very excited about Lilly being with us. Some of you were with us in 2023 when Lilly also talked about Currier and Ives, the collection of Currier and Ives at the Museum of the City of New York. And that was just a magical thing. But we're so excited to have her back again with us tonight. Dr. Lilly Tuttle is the curator at the Museum of the City of New York. And she and I spent an hour in the lounge just talking about how excited she was when she was putting together this exhibition. She's also done City and Games basketball in New York. After she talked to us in 2023, she also curated This is New York, 100 Years of the City and Pop Culture, which I think closes in July?
Last July.
Oh, last July. Okay, I'm a year off. We are just delighted to have her here tonight to talk about New York before computers. Get your head around that one. Okay, Lilly, thank you for joining us.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Caroline, for that introduction. Can everyone see me? I jiggled the podium. Now I'm worried you can't see me. Okay. So Analog City was, I have to be honest and say, in some ways, this was my favorite exhibition I've ever done. And, it happened in 2022. It was kind of the first big normal show we did at the museum after COVID. And prior to COVID, we had always done, for an exhibition like this, we would have done a book. But because of the issues that came up around the pandemic, we just couldn't do one. And so I'd always felt like I wanted this project to have some other life. And so when Caroline said, would you like to come in and do a happy hour of the mind? What would you like to talk on? I was like, Analog City. So I've put together a lot of material. I may have to talk really quickly at the end because one of the things about this topic is that there's just so much stuff. It was basically an exhibition about stuff. The story here is that when kind of the digital becomes manifest, you can fill a gallery with it in about 30 seconds. So without further ado, I will just dive in and say, in this exhibition, I defined what was known as the analog age. The analog age meaning the period roughly between the Civil War and kind of the 1970s, the 1870s to the 1970s, when we're at the dawn of computerization, personal computers, and all of the things that computers would bring. And this was really an extraordinary time for New York City, if you think about it. The city was scaling up physically and economically. It was really a moment where New York kind of, took the helm in the industries that, continue to define it. Things like news and media, information, knowledge, research, finance, and of course, infrastructure. This is the great age of skyscrapers and, new building and bridges and tunnels and roads. But all of this was done without computers. Now, to some of you, you might say, well, yeah, but for a lot of our visitors and people of a certain age, it's kind of mind-blowing to think about all of the things that happened at this time and all of the things that computers do for us that were done with other forms of technology. There was the new technology of things like electricity, the telegraph, the telephone, that really, undergirded all of this. And we talked about that in the exhibition. But the way the exhibition was organized is we defined sort of what were called the building blocks, these things that you may look and say, that is not technology, but it is technology, and that made it possible for New York to become this real hub, in the 20th century. And then the way the exhibition is organized and the way this talk will be organized is around 4 key industries. Those industries that I mentioned a moment ago, knowledge and research, which really focused on the New York Public Library, the news media, which looked at the New York Times, finance, which looked at the New York Stock Exchange, and architecture, and the skyscraper age that came up at that time. So just to give you a sense, this was the exhibition in our title wall. We had a little video down at the end. That's Mia Farrow in a phone booth to show kind of how this analog technology shows up in filmmaking at this time. And we had like a little clip from 9 to 5 and Rosemary's Baby. And if you know, any of you know the movie Desk Set, the great movie with Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, we had a little clip from there. Okay, so the first, just to kick this off, the first building block technology that we looked at in this exhibition is the typewriter. And the typewriter is really a seminal form of technology. It appears in the 1970s. What you see on the left there is a Remington Model, a Remington Model 1 from 1874. This is one of the first mass-marketed typewriters ever produced. It did not have a shift key, so one could only type in all capital letters, which meant you were just shouting every correspondence that you sent. And you couldn't actually see what you were writing. You had to unroll each paper and look at what you had written and then roll it back in. Remington and Sons was an important typewriter manufacturer, and I believe it has to do with the spring action of the type was a very similar action to that of guns. They were a rifle manufacturer, and they transferred the rifle spring action into a typewriter to be sort of another popular form of consumer product. The job of a typist soon thereafter became a new form of employment. In a lot of these new technological jobs, the machine was actually the name of the job. So typists were actually called typewriters. Many of these jobs fell to women, in part because the job it was a new job with no sort of gender associations with it. So typists, file clerks, telephone operators, all women. Generally pretty lowly jobs with little opportunity for advancement. So really perfect for women. So the Remington Model 1, it's an 1874 typewriter. Mark Twain was notably an early adopter of typewriters. I don't know if anyone knows this, but the first sort of published manuscript in the world that was produced on a typewriter was Mark Twain. And he spoke about his Remington very rhapsodically about how it was allowing him to write faster and, saved paper over time. And I just wanted to include, we had a lot of advertising in the exhibition to just kind of show how these things came to market. That's a Royal typewriter. Royal typewriters were, it's a Brooklyn-based company. The company was started in 1904 in Brooklyn. And speaking of Royal, on the left here, this is a Yiddish typewriter. So as soon as typewriters come to the market, the desire for foreign language typewriters and typewriters that could produce different texts than the text we use in English became very important and popular. This is a typewriter that was used at the Jewish Daily Forward down in the Lower East Side in the 1950s. It's a Yiddish typewriter. And their archivist told me that the Forward began receiving letters in Yiddish as early as 1914. So the Yiddish typewriter really kind of hit the market at the beginning of the 20th century. On the right is a Chinese typewriter. We borrowed this from the Museum of Chinese in America. This is fascinating because, Chinese does not just consist of 26 letters. There's actually, in some Chinese dialects, over 70,000 characters. So the way this typewriter, which came from the 1930s and was used at a newspaper in Chinatown, the way it worked is it has a bed of slugs and then a giant tray of slugs next to it. And you load the slugs into the bed, and then the top of the typewriter moves around and picks up the slugs and places them on the tray. But there's a lot of work that's actually gone into understanding how there were so many publications in Chinatown and how news was disseminated among Chinese communities in the United States, given sort of the complexity of the language and the characters. Okay, so typewriters hit the market. Everyone's using typewriters. What does this do? It means there's a lot more paper. How do we deal with this paper? Well, the good news is that because people are using typewriters, it leads us to have standardized paper. And there's no exact date from when 8.5 by 11 paper comes into use, but it presents a new opportunity. If you look at the image on the left, that's from 1895. Most of the images in this slideshow are from the Museum of the City of New York. I'll tell you if they're not. This is quite a filing system. Papers were filed flat, sort of, horizontally like this. What you see there is known as a pigeonhole desk. Maybe not the most efficient form of filing. And what we see at this juncture in this analog age is that these new technologies allow for much greater flexibility and scalability. You know, as things are scaling up, we need to be able to expand and store more and sort of think bigger. You know, this what you see here on the left is not very scalable. And so in the 1890s comes along the vertical filing cabinet where, I mean, I don't think I have to explain this, but papers are stored vertically like this with file folders and tabs, and they can grow and grow and grow. And they are, if you look at this advertisement from 1927, they are likened to skyscrapers. That's actually the Woolworth building behind it, and it's sort of this sense of like the verticality and the thrust of things is really important. And you know, if you think about it, terms like folder, file, and tab are still very much part of the language of computing today. And this is where we get this language and this understanding, this expandability. Okay. Our next building block is the index card. Again, you might be thinking, how is this technology? Well, this actually emerges not only from sort of thinking along the lines of the vertical filing cabinet, but it's actually Melville Dewey, who gives us the Dewey Decimal System, who creates this company in 1888 called the Library Company. He figures out that this fabulous technology that he's invented for libraries is actually a great consumer product that is applicable to a lot of different uses and industries. And if you look at this Macy Card Index advertisement, it says, cumbersome books are the things of the past, because books are not scalable, they're hard to search. You cannot really create a great indexing system in a ledger. So ledgers are out, and we've gone to the card catalog for all sorts of different uses. So in the exhibition, we thought about, okay, well, New York is becoming bigger, more complex, more diverse at this time. Index cards can serve a myriad of uses. And so we went all around, and I found all these opportunities to show the index card, the public school system and beyond the library system, public school system. This is the zoo system. This is a mammal record from the Prospect Park Zoo from 1950. It's a zebra named Lucky Stripe, and shows all of her medical treatment and her various maladies that she was being treated for. But this is just sort of showing how a city like New York is scaling up and systematizing using this new technology. On the left is a Bertillon card, which was a form of sort of criminology, record keeping, in the era before really good fingerprint databases and computerization of criminal records. Bertillon created this kind of creepy system of classification using things like head circumference and arm length to catalog criminals. It didn't last very long, but every criminal, this is someone named William Forbes from 1990, every criminal would have his or her Bertillon measurements entered on a form, so to keep track of them and sort of match them up with a human. On the right is perhaps my favorite thing in the whole exhibition, and it was one of the things that sparked my idea for the show. In 2017, David Rockefeller died at the age of 101. And in the course of his sort of 60-year career of working in finance and foreign affairs and philanthropy, he developed a social network of about 100,000 people. And he had a Rolodex that was about 5 feet wide, custom built. And he had a whole staff of people to update this Rolodex all the time, to update every meeting that he ever had with an artist, a foreign dignitary, you name it. So if you look at this, it's Richard M. Nixon. He used to be addressed Dear Dick or Dear Mr. President. You can see his date of death, Mrs. Nixon's date of death, and all his meetings with Mr. Nixon. And the cards would just get updated and updated. So we had 100,000 or 200,000 cards for 100,000 people. Brooke Astor's record was 16 cards front and back. And I'll tell you, when I was speaking with our archivist and I said, we really want some good cards, like who do you have? He said, the easiest thing is if you tell me who you want, we probably have them. I know. He didn't have Princess Diana. I was sort of bummed about that. Okay, and then a quick word about the telephone. I don't need to explain telephones to all of you, except to say that New York City was a very early adopter, vigorous early adopter of the telephone. Just some fun facts for you here. In 1892, New York had 30,000 miles of underground telephone wires, which was more than in all of Europe. In 1900, New York had the largest number of telephone exchanges in the world, 2 times that of London. Go New York. In 1902, New York Telephone opened the first school in the world for telephone operators. They got 17,000 applicants and accepted 8%. That's like Yale admissions. And then, like typists, it was a female-driven profession with very little upward mobility. Just a quick note here. This is a picture of Alexander Graham Bell on the first Chicago line, and then on the right is the Model 500 telephone. I'm sure every single person in this room has seen and probably operated one of these. It was designed by the great industrial designer Henry Dreyfuss. And the fun thing about this is, that I did not know, is that when area codes were introduced in 1947, they were assigned according to the frequency with which the city was called to make it efficient to dial that city. So it's no accident that New York is 212. And Los Angeles is 213, and Chicago is 312. It's because those are the cities with the highest volume. All right, so the last thing is the calculating device, and this comes up again in our section on architecture. You know, we're building bridges, we're building tunnels, we're building skyscrapers, we're trying to go to the moon in this era. How are we doing it all? And the big key item is the Koeffel and Esser, the K&E duplex slide ruler. Koeffel and Esser was actually an interesting company. They were founded in Lower Manhattan in the 1860s by German immigrants, eventually moved to Hoboken, but they really kind of gave the world of engineering the slide rule. I gave a tour at one point to someone who said he'd been an engineer, and everyone had their K&E. He said, our K&E slide rules tucked in our pockets. But then up at the top there, this is what's called a Thatcher's calculating instrument. It's a cylindrical ruler, and it's able, what I can tell you about this is that it was able to do calculations up to 5 decimal points, and this one in particular was used for designing railroads and railroad bridges. But incredible feats of engineering through these calculating devices. And this thing's quite large, and it's sort of like a rolling pin in real life. And a fun fact that I learned was that when the first space missions were happening, the astronauts actually took slide rulers on board in case they needed to do some complex calculations up there in space. So what does this all mean for New York? Like, okay, great, we've got index cards and slide rulers. What are we doing with them? So, as I said at the outset, the first decades of the 20th century are utterly transformative for New York. In the first 3 decades of the 20th century, the population of New York will double. In 1910, New York City has a foreign-born population of 41%, which is the highest percentage of foreign-born New Yorkers ever in the period after the Civil War. And so there is this remarkable scaling up and complexity in the city. And as I said at the outset, information, research, news media, finance, and infrastructure really become the way in which New York excels at this time. So our first case study is the New York Public Library, which is founded in 1895 with the express mission to educate and acculturate a growing population in New York City, and particularly children. Andrew Carnegie endows a network of branch libraries to build libraries all across Manhattan, the Bronx, and Staten Island. Brooklyn and Queens have their own library branches, but everybody is welcome. This is the Seward Park Library on the Lower East Side. This is just one of many images like this where you see these kids just appearing in droves. There are pictures of them lined up around the block, coming down the stairs. And so, because what's also happening at this time is that there is a real boom in printed material. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, is like why printed material is suddenly in such great volume, but it is. But books are expensive. And these kids probably live in crowded apartments. Their parents probably don't speak English. There are no books in their homes. And so the opportunity to get a free book in English is really a remarkable gift. But the library is contending with a lot of issues. In 1911, the main branch on 42nd Street and 5th opens. The building was designed by the firm Curator and Hastings, but the interior of it was designed by a man named John Shaw Billings. And this is a cutaway picture of it. And you can see it's kind of this marvel of modern technology with electric lights and elevators and dumbwaiters and pneumatic tubes. And it really sort of looks like a machine. And it's kind of a remarkable feat. But very early on, the issue with the public library is going to be space. That, as I mentioned at the outset, this stuff is scalable, it's great, it can expand, but over time, the challenge is going to be where to put it all. By 1970, the New York Public Library had index cards, card catalog for over 11 million items. And so quickly space became an issue, and the card catalog itself became this sort of cumbersome issue, or cumbersome problem. So the solution to that was to create this volume known as the Dictionary Catalog. In 1972, the library basically took a snapshot, frozen in time, of their card catalog. Many, 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 many volumes were produced to show their library, the catalog, frozen in time. But what this enabled was then this catalog could be shipped to Los Angeles. You could be in the library at UCLA and access the card catalog at the New York Public Library. And this was a start, but over time, the library really, this was just a colossal challenge for the library to deal with the amount of printed material and the amount of information that they were trying to get out into the world. I'm going to talk quickly about two resources that the New York Public Library had that have been completely obliterated by digital technology. The first one is the picture collection. Has anyone here ever used the New York Public Library picture collection? So basically, okay, Caroline's raising her hand. I know, I used it once upon a time. Basically, at the main branch of the New York Public Library, they still have, but it used to be much bigger, a room full of pictures. Boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of pictures. At one point, they had 5 million pictures in this room. And it was used by designers, artists, fashion designers, people of all stripes all across the world. There was a woman named Ramona Javits who developed a very distinctive cataloging system for this. She really kind of thought about how to make this collection accessible to people, how to help people kind of find their way through it and have that wonderful thrill of discovery. Andy Warhol was notably very, very fond of the picture collection. And to be honest, you'd literally check these pictures out and take them home. And Warhol notably checked the pictures out, took them home, and then never took them back. And now they're in the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh. But apparently the public library thinks that's great. But when I was doing research for the exhibition, I found all these letters from, the Red Cross or some children's choir in Kansas City or a butcher in Ireland who need a picture of something, and she would try to answer these as best she could. But it was a very big collection. It was a project, a WPA project, as so many things were, to catalog this and kind of come up with ways to make it accessible. And one thing she came up with was this system of call slips that you see on the right, where she literally had people, if they wanted a picture of something, she asked you to draw it. And the reason she did this was, not only for accuracy, but to make this collection more accessible to people who didn't speak English. So the other thing that the New York Public Library had that I was quite enchanted by is this Ask a Librarian system, where basically in the days before Google, if you had a question about, when was Queen Victoria's birthday or how to care for an orchid, you'd call the library. And they would very often type up the questions that they received and keep them in files. Now, when I was everyone's reading this and it's a riot, yeah. How do you find out his name? When I was doing this exhibition, I knew about these cards and I'd seen them in other places, but it's a funny thing with the New York Public Library where their own institutional record keeping is not awesome. So it was a little hard to locate these, but they found a few of them, and this was a really good one. Ask a Librarian went away in 1996 when they went over to email, and then I think Google probably killed the whole thing. But they're very cool. They actually put out a little book of them. You were? Yeah. Do they still do it? I did until I was there until 1990. All right. So we have a librarian you can ask. That's amazing. Yeah, so basically, you have a question, you ask a librarian. I should say that to my kids, like they have a question to say, ask a librarian. Okay, so moving on to news media. New York at one point was a major newspaper town. In 1920, there were 15 daily papers published in New York City, and that's just in English. There was a huge, wide-ranging, diverse foreign press. And with every case study in this exhibition, I looked at well, what's the challenge? In the New York Public Library, it's space. In the story of the Times, and I focused on the Times because it's the paper that still exists. It was easy to kind of go in there. And I worked with, if you're curious, I worked with a guy named David Dunlop. You might know his byline, David W. Dunlop. He went to Yale. And he's sort of become the de facto archivist and memory keeper at the Times. He's pretty much retired. But he and I went digging through closets, and he was like throwing things at me one day. It was very fun. The press and the news was just a huge industry in New York City in the middle of the 20th century. And the key challenge here is, how do you bring the news in from around the globe? I mean, there are 2 world wars that happened during this time period, plus the Cold War. And then get that news kind of written up and then back out the door 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a day. And it's really a race against the clock. I just wanted to show a little bit here about Chinatown, because this was sort of a theme throughout the exhibition. How do people get their news? These ladies are reading the Daily News on the subway. I should just mention Stanley Kubrick. We have Stanley Kubrick's photographs when he was a teen photographer for Look magazine in the 1940s. It's pretty cool. And then in Chinatown, this picture here, it's a news wall. And basically, the way news was disseminated in Chinatown was sort of like really old-fashioned, like kind of the days from like Andrew Jackson, where they would just put up broadsides. That's called a bugaoban, and it was just a way, this is 1944, a way to get news from China that people would just gather around and read every day, again, because of the issues in printing that I mentioned earlier. So these pictures here, this is from a series by this woman, Marjorie Collins, who was a photojournalist for the Office of War Information. These are not MCNY pictures. These came from the Library of Congress. And she did this whole behind-the-scenes series about the Times. And basically, what kept the Times running and kept this news coming in was a fleet of telegraph operators, who you see there on the left. And they had about 20 different telegraph operators just bringing in news, and they would type up what they were getting on the telegraph there. And they had 6 dedicated telegraph operators just for sports. And then the machine there on the right is called a Hellscriber. It was designed by a German man named Rudolf Hell. I know very little about this, and in all the research I did, I tried to find out more about it. Even David Dunlop could not tell me what this was. It looks to me, from what I understand, he's getting news off the radio, like radio broadcasts. They would have the radio tuned to German news 24/7, and it would somehow spit out a transcription of the news, or what was coming across the radio. But it's a little bit of a mystery to me. In addition to the telegraph, they used the teletype machine, which is basically the closest thing to email. They had about a dozen teletype machines going all the time. This is where people would talk about, getting news off the wires. And in the middle there, we borrowed an old teletype machine from the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. And this was just like they would just pull this stuff out and see what was coming across the wires and say, should we print this, should we not print this? Sort of all the news kind of coming in this room. On the right there, this is something we borrowed. There is a little tiny museum within the New York Times that Mr. Dunlop showed me around and is extremely proud of. This is probably hard to read, but this is a teletype message to Arthur Sulzberger from 1971 from John Mitchell, the Attorney General, telling him that they are in violation of the policies of the Department of Defense by printing the Pentagon Papers, and telling them that they must cease printing the Pentagon Papers and return them to the Department of Defense. And it seems to me like what Mr. Sulzberger did with this was frame it and put it on the wall. So they're very proud of this teletype at the New York Times. So then what happens once the news comes in, it goes down to the writers, they write up the news, then what? How do we get this paper out the door every day? And the answer is they roll up the story, they pop it in a pneumatic tube, and send it down to the composing room, to be pumped out on this machine here, which is called a linotype machine. And I learned everything I ever wanted to know about linotype machines during this exhibition. The linotype machine was invented in the 1880s by a German immigrant named Othmar Mergenthaler. But basically, the thing of this machine is it was the biggest breakthrough in printing technology since Gutenberg and the invention of movable type. Because what it did was it took these big, long rods of lead that were called pigs, and it heated them up, and then a person like this gentleman here would sit there and type words into the machine, and it would spit out entire lines of type. And so it sped up exponentially the rate and the volume with which printed material could be produced. And so at the times, there would be a room full of these linotype machines churning out blocks of text, all day long. This is how they got the paper out. It was very sort of hot, sweaty industrial work, because then what they would do is then every night they would take what was called the lockup of each page, melt it down again, and start over the next day. These machines were really huge and really clunky, they were replaced in the 1970s by what was called, this was hot type. This is where you get the expression hot off the presses. And then they switched to a more computerized method of printing, which they all refer to as cold type. There's a great documentary about this I can share with you later if anyone's interested in this, because it's a pretty great story. So the guys would be down there typing away, printing out these lines of type. This is what they would produce. This is called a lockup here, where they would have the lines of type laid out, and then that would get turned into printed paper. This thing here, we borrowed this from the Times as well. This is called the scoreboard. It's basically a piece of plastic with light bulbs behind it, and it would be all lit up, and it was a way for the composing room and the editors to communicate with each other. And every time the light went out, that showed that that page of that section had been put to bed. So it's like, you're done for the day. And so the goal was every day, twice a day, to get all the lights out on the scoreboard in time to have the paper hit the newsstands. So then what happens when this is all done, right? Like, what do we do with the Times? Like, where does it go? And the answer is, for a long time, and even still to this day, it goes to a place called the morgue. The morgue is a giant cavernous underground space underneath the old New York Times building, but you can get to it from the new New York Times building. It's very cool. Basically, starting in the 1870s, the New York Times began the project of clipping out every story that they published and filing it with the intention of creating keyword files. If you want to understand what the Times wrote about Lincoln, Abraham, you would go in there and look for Lincoln, Abraham. The morgue is still run by this gentleman on the right here. His name is Jeff Roth. I worked with him on this exhibition. He's a totally cool guy. He's the only clippings filer left, but he's been there for decades. And the truth of the matter is, I'm sure a lot of you, we've all gone on the New York Times. You go on New York Times Machine, you can find, articles from way back. The reality is the New York Times, at the time this story was published about Jeff, so it was 2017, it was a few years ago, they have about 5 to 7 million photographic prints that have not been digitized. They have tens of millions of clippings, and they've digitized at that point about 2%. When I was down in the morgue with Jeff, researchers were coming in asking for things. And what's great is if you look on the back of the prints, they're all stamped up with where they came from, and where they went. So it is, you sort of want to look at this and think it's really quaint, but it actually serves an incredible purpose, that there's a whole backlog of information that does not actually live on the web. Okay, so our next case study is the New York Stock Exchange. And the story here, really, I'll just give it away. So we've talked about space, we've talked about time. This is also kind of a time story. It's about speed. And looking at the way in which the stock exchange just expanded and sped up in terms of volume and trading volume throughout the 20th century. And it soon became impossible for human beings and this paper-based technology to keep up. We called it trading at the speed of paper to give you a sense of kind of what the challenges were. So the New York Stock Exchange really took off and had a boom after the Civil War. The stock ticker was invented in 1867, and it was not long after that that in many ways the stock exchange became sort of the nerve center of the American economy. The big building on Wall Street that I'm sure you all know opened in 1903, and by 1969 there were about 2,600 traders and employees swarming the floor every day. In 1952, someone referred to it as an orderly kind of chaos. So I just wanted to show these are sort of two fun parallel images. The first is, this depicts what was known as the curbstone market and curbstone brokers. I just thought this was really funny. It was a small kind of brokerage system just outside the stock exchange. These guys would sell kind of like iffy, sketchy, like industrial stocks, and they were not welcome in the New York Stock Exchange around this time, so they would literally hang out the window and yell their trades into Wall Street traders' offices across the street, and they would use hand signals to each other. Yes, but in 1928, to kind of clean things up a little bit, and for the people who were allowed in the New York Stock Exchange, in 1928, the Stock Exchange opens this thing called the quotation department. So nowadays, if you want to know, what's Apple trading at, what's General Electric trading at, you just look it up on your phone, you look it up online. So the way you did this back then is you would call the quotation department and you'd get a quote. And the way this worked, if I can sort of explain this. This took me a long time to figure out, is this lady here is on the phone with the guys down on the floor. And they were called the quotation boys. And then she would update this board up here. And if you look down here, there's a whole line of these ladies here. They would update the board. And then the operators would have the information, and they would be in different sectors, industrial stocks and so on and so forth. And so you would call the operator and get a quote for what the bid ask was. And this was something that was really necessary by the 1920s because of the volume that was picking up. And just to give you an idea of kind of where things were going at this time, when the quotation department opened in 1928, they fielded about 1.8 million quotations. And in 1936, it was 24 million. Which seemed completely counterintuitive to me, like who's buying and selling stocks during the Great Depression? But the stock market kept booming after 1929. Imagine that. So just a word about pneumatic tubes. Pneumatic tubes, this is like the great analog technology that I feel like everybody misses. And pneumatic tubes were part of the New York Public Library. They were part of the Times. They were used in department stores, hospitals, everywhere, banks. But they were a very, very, very central part of the stock exchange. So I thought I would talk about them here. And it was basically with the way all the information that was, everything that was happening on the trading floor went out into the world, onto that, famous stock ticker. And what would happen was the trading slips, a sort of marking down a trade that had happened, and the price at which the stock was sold or bought. Whoopsie, I went too far. That's just a great picture of pneumatic tubes. Everything kind of went here. This is called a tube man, who would be in one of those big sort of horseshoe-shaped trading pits, as they were called, and would put the slips in these little tubes to go down the pneumatic tube into this space here, which was called the ticker room. And these ladies here would pull the tube out of the ticker and then feed them here to this woman who's plugging them in to this ticker here. And that's how they're going out into the world, where they will be read at brokerage houses around the city, at private clubs, at the Waldorf Astoria. And this machine right here is called a black box ticker, which was a very fast ticker for its time. But even still, the issue is those tubes are coming fast and furious, and you can only update the machine as fast as a person can type, and you can see she's feeding the slips to this woman, and they're just going and going and going. It's sort of like that Lucille Ball thing where like the chocolates are on the conveyor belt. So what ended up happening, and this is a great photo from the MCNY collection. I couldn't resist. That's a bank. This is the pneumatic tube system. So what ends up happening is there's this insane delay on the ticker tape. And by the middle of the 20th century, it's understood that whatever price you're going to see up on the ticker tape is delayed by about 15 to 20 minutes. And this just builds up and builds up and builds up, such that in April of 1968, sort of coinciding, I think, with some really bad moments in the Vietnam War. The stock market actually has to stop trading one day because they're so far behind. They're like, it's like a freight train that's out of control. And they end up curtailing their hours, like they close early on Wednesdays because they are just so far behind. And this is something you start hearing about. This image here is called the paperwork crisis, and you start hearing this a lot in the 1970s. There's sort of a talk about how there's a paperwork crisis. But we found all these pictures of the guys just sweeping up these mountains of paper every day, to say nothing of then all the filing work that has to happen after the market closes to file the stock certificates and kind of reconcile all the records. So needless to say, it was a mess, and they were really happy to have computers come into the New York Stock Exchange in the 1970s. Okay, and then the last section here, I'm not horrible on time. The last section here is about architecture, and so we called it Scaling Up Skyscraper City. And this is really kind of a twofold story. I'll just mention this is a drawing by Hugh Ferris of the Bank of Manhattan building at 40 Wall Street. And Hugh Ferris was one of the great architectural illustrators of his time. He did incredible drawings of the World's Fair, which are, some of which are in the museum's collection. But what happens here is not only are we entering sort of a glory day of the American skyscraper, the skyscraper actually serves a purpose. It's a container for all of the work that we've been talking about. This is the moment of the banks and the real estate firms and all of the kind of the publishing companies and, all of the things that are making New York tick at this time. Well, they all need a place to go. All those filing cabinets, all those telephone exchanges, all those typists need a place to go. So the skyscrapers, they're beautiful and they're icons of the city, but they're actually containers for all the work that's happening. And they're, of course, enabled by, steel frames and elevators and even air conditioning in some cases. So it's not a coincidence that we're getting these great buildings at the time. But of course, they are all drawn and designed by hand. This is a photograph on the left of the drafting room of Curator and Hastings, the firm that, among other things, designed the New York Public Library building on 42nd and 5th. And we had a lot, on view in the exhibition, we had a lot of these wonderful little tools that architects would use at this time. And it's just kind of remarkable to think about these buildings and these pieces of infrastructure were designed with like really sharp pencils and protractors and compasses. And if you can look in this box, there's like 4 different kinds of compasses that are used to design different parts of the building. And this is a drafting kit from the firm E&O Richter. And it's a deluxe drafting kit. And so this would have sold in 1917 for about $75, which is about $1,800 today. So this was really sort of like your state-of-the-art computer in the 19-teens. Okay, this is my last picture. So in addition to drawing these buildings, what architects had to do in many instances was build physical models. I think a lot of times it was almost impossible for an architect to kind of translate a concept to an engineer who was actually going to build this thing and generate a construction drawing without a 3D model. And one of the more challenging buildings that was built in this analog age was the TWA terminal at JFK Airport, which was designed by the Finnish architect Eero Saarinen. So Saarinen notably actually built this gigantic model. They had to take on extra space adjacent to their offices just for the model. And he would climb inside of it and look around to make sure that the building would stay up and these sort of winged walls would actually, that they could be built by a person. It's my understanding that they really weren't sure if this building was actually going to stay up. Nowadays this would all be done with 3D renderings and printers, but this is how they got it done in 1960. So that's my last slide. I just thought I would show you a few pictures. This is what the exhibition looked like back in 2022. And I just want to point out here, we had these little sections here called Try Me, where we had an IBM Selectric typewriter, a Model 500 phone, a couple of other things, and we wanted people to come in and type on the typewriter. We wanted kids to see if they could dial the long-distance number on a rotary dial phone. We had a slide ruler, which I really struggled with that. We brought a linotype machine into the museum, which was, I think, one of the bigger challenges of things I've done at my time at the museum. And the guy who, we borrowed it from a press out at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and they offered to let us keep it. They were like, this thing, he said, there are printing companies in Chelsea, which was a great center of printing. He said there was a time when they were literally just pushing them out the window. I assume the back window. But I loved this thing, but we were like, we can't keep it. And he was sort of like, do you want it? And so we just, this was in some ways, the challenge of this exhibition was that there was just so much stuff. This is a little model of one of the trading pits at the stock exchange that had been created and shown for the 1939 World's Fair. Yeah, it was really cool. And then the last section of the exhibition was called Still Analog, where we talked about how some of the weather events in New York and some of the issues that came up during the pandemic really highlighted how some people in the city, or like our transit system, are sort of unwillingly still in this analog world. And it's like we were sort of like rhapsodizing about, the good old days of not being online, but actually, if you are living in a digital world, and you don't have access to the digital, it's actually kind of really problematic. And when the subway shuts down for 3 days because it rains, that's when you kind of miss the digital technology. So anyway, that's the exhibition. I managed to do it in 45 minutes.
So we're gonna open it up for questions. Andrew?
That was a fantastic talk, thank you. Just a quick question about the morgue room at the Times. Do they have backup files and fire protection?
So I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
For the morgue at the New York Times, do they have backup files of the
No,
print?
I mean for
or
the
fire
things.
protection?
No, they're in. That's the thing. I mean, they're underground. They're in those big. The great thing about the vertical filing cabinet is they're totally fireproof. But I mean, no, for the things that haven't been digitized, that's it. I mean, make no mistake, the New York Times exists in microfilm all across the globe. So it's not like all of that news would be lost. But the thing that's incredible about it is the fact that it's organized by keyword and subject. So if you are like, wow, what did the New York Times have to say about, I don't know, like the Battle of Gettysburg or something really far back to their earliest days, you'd have to just go through all the microfilm and read. Whereas this is a way that you can go. I mean, I was standing there with Jeff one day and it was like, Clinton, William Jefferson, Clinton, Hillary, and you just can kind of go through and it's like an index. And the New York Times index also exists, but then to actually go and find it, is somewhat onerous.
I guess I have a question. What is the big difference between the telegraph and the wire, the telex?
Sure. So the telegraph comes through in Morse code. It's like beep, 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 beep. And so someone sits there, and these guys were incredible. They could just translate the Morse code and type into a typewriter. Whereas a telex uses telegraph wires, but if you remember that slide, it has a little keyboard. It's like not that far from email, where you type into the keyboard and it comes out the other end. If you've ever seen the movie All the President's Men, where it's like and it comes out like that. And so you'd go into this room and the machines would just be spitting out sheets like that. So basically that note from John Mitchell was kind of like an email.
So you mentioned the linotype documentary that was really interesting. Because
Okay.
what is the name of it?
Okay.
Or how do we...
Wait for it. Okay, you might want to write this down. It's called Farewell, Etoyen, Shrudlu. Right? Okay. The reason for that is the keyboard on the linotype is not a QWERTY keyboard. It's a totally distinct keyboard, and you watch these guys type, and they're like... So the letters that go down the side, it was not... I don't totally understand the ergonomics of it, but they figured out those were the most common letters that they were going to be typing in. So it's called Farewell, Etoyen, Shrudlu, and I believe it's available online. Like, I just got it off of like Vimeo. It's fantastic. And I'll tell you just one, because I was obsessed with this. One funny story is like the big pieces of lead that they used were made, or they were lead. And I said, oh gosh, this must have been like a giant health hazard. Like all these guys must have died really young. And my linotype person said, yeah, because they were all smoking 24/7. It wasn't the lead, it was the cigarettes. But an interesting fact that you will learn if you watch this documentary is that it was actually, the room, it was so loud and so hot. I mean, it's kind of interesting to think about this sort of industrial production happening under Manhattan in Midtown. And it was so hot and so loud that actually linotype operating was a very common job for people who were hearing impaired, because they would just sign with each other. And it was easier than speaking because the room was so loud.
This is something from the end of the talk. You mentioned the still analog portion, and you mentioned the public transit system as part of that. I was curious, in what ways, or I guess many ways, is the public transit system in New York still analog?
Oh my God, how much time you got? So basically the signaling system is from the 1930s. So the issue in New York City, on most lines, I think the L and the 7, they've upgraded. So if you look at like our subway system versus London uses this system, I can't remember what it's called, but it's like radio something something, where they can tell where the trains are, so they can run them more frequently. Because there's like a signaling system that lets the trains talk to each other and the conductors know where the trains are. Literally, the signaling system in New York City is the train hits a signal and flips a switch. And that's where the train is. So part of the reason why the trains can only run at certain intervals is because they don't always know where they are. And the signals, I mean, how many times have you been on the train and they say, due to a signal malfunction? And they're having to basically cannibalize parts from within their own backlog of parts, because these things aren't made anymore. So we have infrastructure from the 1950s down in the subway system, and when it rains or when something breaks or malfunctions, they have to go back into the storeroom and like wire it up. So it's like literally look at like New York versus London, and it's quite remarkable.
Lilly, you said you had a documentary for us to watch?
That was the linotype documentary.
Is it on YouTube?
Yeah, I think I found it on Vimeo. I just Googled it. I just found it online.
Yeah, I guess if you go farewell, then ETAOIM.
Yeah.
You'll find it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyone with
Ask a
another-
librarian.
No, I literally worked at New York Public Library from 1993 till 1997 when I started at Horace Mann. People would call and say,
What were some of the questions?
oh, just everything.
Like what?
It's hard to, if you were in a branch library, you would only get stuff sort of about your branch. But one of the things I've also found really interesting about looking in the archives here, we had a ticker tape. We had a New York Stock Exchange ticker tape outside the main lounge for years, so that people having a cocktail could be like, I wonder how my stocks are doing. You know, and it was one of the things that the club was very proud of, the fact that when we opened, we were fully electric. We had a telegraph system, we had a phone system, and they kept track of how many messages they took each day. I mean, this was a big point of pride in 1915 when we opened, about how modern the club was.
And then I just to build off of that, this whole area was really, because Grand Central opens in 1913, and it's what is a catalyst for this whole area.
Little Wall Street.
Yeah, and
That's what it was called.
Little Wall Street, and the Waldorf Astoria was known. I mean, it was just the most high-tech. They had telegraph boys who would run all over the hotel giving you your time. I mean, that was really how they marketed themselves. It was like for like the business person on the go. And we had a picture, I didn't put it in the slide talk, but we had a picture of women in the lobby who just like pulling out the ticker tape, and they had like an annunciator board in the lobby of the Waldorf Astoria where they would put stock prices up so that you could, you know, stay in the know during your stay. And this is really, I mean, this is how Michael Bloomberg became a billionaire, is he figured out that the idea of real-time information, you know, he created this thing called the Market Master, which I remember coming here when there was a Market Master in the lobby. That was, you know, really like the keys to the kingdom before smartphones.
Anyone else, a question?
Is there any possibility you might bring the exhibit back to the museum?
No.
All the work.
I know, it's sort of painful. It was a lot of work. I mean,
You could I think
I have thought in my own life that I was really, before, when we were first cooking this up in 2019, there was going to be a book. And then the book didn't happen. So when Caroline said, you should, you know, put a talk together, I said, well, why don't I put this together so I have it? Because I do think that this is a topic that, you know, we did this whole thing at the museum of like intergenerational tours, where it was like, bring your grandkids and teach them how to use a rotary dial phone. And actually my father-in-law took our kids and taught them how to use a rotary dial phone and a slide ruler. So just that idea of like, it's like nostalgia for some people and like, a completely foreign land for some people. Yes, sir.
I have a question.
Yes.
Of all of the items that you discovered during your research for the exhibition, which one do you think is most due for a resurrection?
That is a great question. Which of the items, I mean, I would almost throw that back to you all and say, is there anything you miss? I mean, I personally still read paper books. I abandoned my Kindle because I can't deal with Kindle. I'll tell you, I think the picture collection, because I think Google image search is not useful. And I think that what I got out of reading the correspondence around that, and like, there was a period sort of towards the, like in the 40s, when they were gonna curtail the hours of the picture collection. And she got letters, she got a letter from Norman Bel Geddes, who was like, you cannot do this. Like, the American design will die. The arts will die. This is too important. And I think there was something about the serendipity of just swimming around in these images and letting it kind of fill your brain. We don't do that anymore. It's like browsing in a bookstore or like doing that kind of research where one thing leads to the other and it kind of turns your wheels. Like, we just go in and we're like, find me this, find me that. But you don't know what you don't know until you're confronted with 5 million images. So it's daunting, but I think just seeing how sticky it was for people, and there's a whole world on the picture collection. Like, there are artists, like there's this artist, Taryn Simon, who does work around the picture collection. Like, it's its own kind of, like, there's like a whole like micro obsession around the picture collection. But I think it's very telling about what research kind of should be, especially in that field.
All right, one more question.
So rather than the past, look to the future. 75 years from now, turn of the next century, what would be 2 or 3 things that you would put in this lecture?
Oh. You know, I actually think, you know, there's a way in which, I have to tell you this, something else we had in the exhibition that I maybe didn't get to. This is maybe, I'm gonna answer your question. We had a case out in the hallway full of all this stuff, and it was all stuff that we just brought in from home. Like a little Rolodex thing.
I still have one.
Yeah, and the little while you were out thing, and the Kodak disc. And we would have kids come in and we would say, this is everything that you do on your phone. Everything. We had personals ads, we had a Zagat guide, we had a Telegram. We were like, this is it. It's all just a smartphone now. So that was fun. It was like everyday life. What would I put in it? I mean, I feel like everything is just like on your phone and your smartwatch now. I mean, I don't want to say newspapers because I still like to read a paper. I don't know. I mean, I think print media is really, really, really struggling. But I also think, I think there's a counterintuitive thing here too, that I didn't want to like totally say like, we're all just, becoming digital idiots. Like, I actually think like there's a lot of data that suggests that bookstores are doing really, really well. I just saw Barnes & Noble is opening a whole bunch of new stores. I think that the pandemic made people want to kind of get back to reality a little bit. And so I tried with this exhibition not to be totally, that the whole thing had to be just like this elegy for like a bygone time. And I think the challenge really is to find the middle ground. Like, yes, texting is really helpful, but like doing things face to face or like writing someone a letter or calling them up on the telephone is really, really important. And I kind of want to think that people are kind of turning back to that in some way because we miss it. And I think we went without it for a couple of years and it was really a drag. So, yes, ma'am.
I work in a very data-driven type thing. And I just feel like if I have to sit down and read 100 pages of international tax regulations, I actually have to print it out and kind of use colored pens to really get it into my brain. If I tried to read it all on my computer, it just doesn't even sink into my brain. So
I hear
think
that
there's
completely.
like a big thing to go with paper. I mean, I wish that weren't true. If you'd see my office, it's piles of paper. But I mean,
You should get a filing cabinet.
is it just me or is it? Oh, I have.
No,
five
is it
files.
generational? I have to print things out too, and I will.
But you know what, actually, Pamela, is not a generational thing. I worked in a high school where the big idea was, let's go to online textbooks. You know what the kids would do? They'd come into the library, and they'd print out every chapter that
That's
they
great.
needed to do
Yeah.
because they needed to actually hold the paper and read it and be able to mark it up. And since then, most schools have gone away from one-to-one, like iPad use and things like that, because kids don't retain.
Yeah, and they
So-
learn how. I have a 6th grader, and one of the things she has to do for homework is annotate. So she'll sit with a book, and she has to learn how to mark it up with a pen.
So, I mean, I think this has given us a ton of things to think about. And I want you to kind of think ahead. In April, Colleen Shogan, who's a Yale grad, who was just recently the National Archivist of the United States, will be our guest for Happy Hour for the Mind.
Cool.
And we're going to be talking about archives and what we keep and what we don't keep. And, one of the big questions I have in all the work I'm doing here in the club, the reason why this was so fascinating is because tons of paper and actual objects existed. But when things are created digitally, and they're only in the digital world, you don't know what you're looking for unless you know what you're looking for.
That's exactly it.
So that's one of the things that I really think about here in the club. I'm able to do all those exhibits because we have a rich collection of actual paper and documents and activities cards and all that kind of stuff. But when it's no longer created like that, what's an exhibit like this going to look like? So that's something we're looking forward. Next month, we actually have Allison Robinson, who's one of the curators at New York Historical.
I know her.
Who did a great talk for us last year on Kara Walker, is going to be back talking about the exhibit that she curated at New York Historical on Title IX activism. And we're going to have at least one, possibly more, Yale members of like the class of 1976, 79, who were part of the strip-in. That was a big part of Title IX activism. So that's coming up next month. Second Wednesday of the month is Happy Hour for the Mind. Lilly, thank you for joining us tonight.
All right. Thank you for coming.